Hello and welcome to the last nap time of this series. I'm James Dilley and I'll be rounding off this season by looking at blade cores. Now I've covered a lot in this season. I feel like I've really gone from the basics right to the advanced parts. So there really is a lot there to sink your teeth into, well, your napping hammers, and try and work through. In future seasons, we'll perhaps look at other parts in detail and cover some things that we've already looked at from a different angle and try some new things, because we're learning alongside you how to get the craft of napping across in a clear, easy to understand way. But for today, as I said, I'm going to be looking at detaching the long shards of flint that actually are known as blades. Before I actually take off some chunks, I'm going to look at the tools required, as that's always a nice place to start. Typically, I use two methods to detach blades. I use both hammerstones on direct percussion by striking the top of the platform without any other tools. The other method, known as indirect percussion, where I'll use an antler punch and a wooden mallet. And because I'm using a punch, it's that makes it indirect. For my hammerstones, I often just use these slightly softer limestone hammers, and as I said, just hit them directly onto the striking platform. For indirect percussion, just an antler tine and a wooden mallet. Sometimes I'll use a lighter mallet, but it's a good solid boxwood mallet that I've talked a little bit about in the thin-in and soft hammers episode. But I'll use this in a very similar way to how you might expect a chisel and a mallet to be used, but of course on the edge of the core on the striking platform. Antlers are really good material for this. As you use them, you may notice little bits are flaked off them, and you may just have to regrind them off as you go. This particular type of antler is moose, but reindeer can be quite good, or red deer can work quite well too for different parts of the process. And really you just have to get used to them, because even different angles, you can see I've got this one here, this one here which is slightly curved, and this one which is a bit shorter but slightly curved with more like a carpenter's pencil tip to it. They're all good for different things really, and as you make them and have to regrind them to take away these chips, you'll find some that perform really well for certain things and some that don't, and that'll all come with part of the process. But I do find a slight curve on your punches really helps to actually get those long thin blades off and prevent the shock from coming back into the core itself. Now, I've talked about these a lot, but a nice rough sandstone abrader's really good for preparing the edge as well. So I'd recommend something rough. It doesn't have to be sandstone, piece of granite, or even just a piece of old concrete with a fairly consistent grain to it. Perfect. So now I'll look at the flint that I'm going to be using today. It's a nice dark piece of flint that's come from a sand and gravel system. You can see that around the orangey cortex, with a bit of white poking through, there is this lovely dark flint underneath that should be really glassy. You may have seen pictures of blade cores which have a perfectly conical shape to them, lovely flat top, and they're almost symmetrical all the way around. They're not particularly typical in European archaeology. Generally, cores are quite opportunistic, really, but you do occasionally get these conical cores. They're often not very big. Once they get down to about that kind of size, they often end up conical because people in prehistory have tried to use them as much as physically possible. This is going to be a little bit of a challenge to actually start this off, but I reckon there could be some blades that come off the front here, and I may just have to use this side to help prepare the edge. And it's absolutely okay to take blades off from both sides or different angles. It was done in the past. Because people are opportunistic, you wouldn't just knock off a useful piece just because it doesn't bode well in that perfect conical shape. You, after the blades, remember this bit that's left is the waist, the core. So how to get into it? I have of course already got my safety features on that you can already see, and please watch the safety video that's in this playlist. I'll start with a hard hammer first and use this convenient face here to actually take a large flake off the top, and hopefully that'll open up my first striking platform. So I've got this nice hard quartzite hammer, And if you've been watching some of the previous episodes, you'll perhaps see for the basic flakes episode that I will be using angles like this to then take more flakes off. That's essentially what I'll be doing, really. So I'll aim for about 1/2 centimetre to 1 centimetre in and just try and take a nice large flat flake off the top. If the flint doesn't break in half, of course. And you can see that there's quite a large flaw here. You can see where some iron has snuck in, and a few other bits and pieces have got in there, and there's another little flaw over there. But actually, when pieces of flint break like this, it can actually offer more opportunities, really, because I've got that nice flat platform now that I can utilise. I may have to do a bit more work in places just to change the angle, but that's all part of the process with blade cores. I'll have a look at the other side. And again, a fairly flat platform. Get some small blades off here. I might have to do a bit of work around here, but I might come back to that later. Let's look at that first piece. So in terms of the edge angles, again referring back to some of the previous episodes, it's important to make sure the edge angle is under 90 degrees. I've got this slightly bulbous convex striking platform here, and really for blade cores the striking platform wants to be ever so slightly concaved, so I may actually have to push some flakes up over the surface to really dish it out a bit first. The angle here is under 90 degrees, but as I come around here, it actually flicks out at the bottom and it becomes over 90 degrees. I could probably try and drive a blade through here, but it would stop here. It'd be best to try and flake across to push that edge back a little bit. So what I'm going to do first is try and dish out this platform here. And I've got my 2 leg leathers, so I'll swap one to this side so both are covered. And I'm going to use my legs as a brace, so I can put the core in between, choose a punch. I think I'll go for this one, and go for the mallet, of course. Position it nicely so it's quite secure, and you can see that I'm just tilting the punch, not so it's straight down, because remember the flakes like to try and flick outwards, and I'm allowing it to do that, and I really want it to actually dish out this striking platform on top, so I'm really trying to help it as much as possible. A good sharp strike on the top is what I need. There we go. And it's just dished out that platform just a little bit. That's all I need. Take another one. I'm being quite cautious. I really don't want to hit the edge too hard and take away a lot of material. And I'm having to fight my way through the cortex as well. So it's worth slowly building up power rather than going for a whacking great hit early on. There we go. That's all that's needed. Move on. Another one. So there we go. It's nicely dished here. There's a bit of a hinge fracture. That's actually sort of a half step, half hinge that hasn't gone through yet. But the important thing that this edge here is dished and concave, and that's exactly what I want. I can drive a flake through here later to sort it out, but the important thing is I have that edge, so I can actually start off the process. So I'll put the punch and mallet down for now and move back to the abrader and actually prepare the edge a little bit, because I want to make contact with my punch into the flint. The cortex has very little strength in comparison, and certainly around this edge here there's a really nice angle there for some initial flakes to go through. Bit of a concavity there, so I'm going to have to push back the edge to try and encourage more of a consistent curve, and it does still flare out there a little bit, as I said earlier, so I'm going to have to deal with that. So I'll slightly tilt the flint. I'm being quite aggressive with it. I am going to take off some very small flakes, nothing too large. It's just to expose that flint edge instead of that cortexy edge. And with any flake, the shock that I put into it will follow the topography. So if there are any ridges or high points, it will generally go to them. Now there isn't really any ridges here at the moment, so the shock that I put in will either try and go in a straight line if the surface is perfectly flat, or it will follow any high points in that surface topography. There's a bit of a bulge there, and there's of course this ridge over here. So if I remove them, I will start to manipulate where that shock is going to go. So I'm going to try and now tilt this on the side and get rid of this bulbous area here, because I want this to be slightly curved inwards rather than flicking outwards. Sometimes you can use a punch to do this. You don't have to do it all with hammerstone if you need quite a precise point to work on, but I think I might be able to get this with a hammerstone. Find out where I put it down. There we go. I don't want a hard hit because I'm only trying to take off a surface flake. I'm not trying to remove mass material. There's another lovely flaw just under the surface. So you can see how that rather than having a clean flake, just completely shattered. And there we go, it's really just crumbling rather than flaking properly. But it's got rid of the issue. What I'll say at this point is these blades won't be particularly long simply because I'm being restricted by the flaws in this, but it's the same kind of problem that people would have had in the past, and if you've got the most lovely piece of flint that you're able to drive great big long blades off, it's perhaps an unlikely representation of most blade core reduction in the past. So I'll do a little bit of edge prep, just check that all those angles are right. You can see that I'm attacking it from the other side now because I just want to curve it back a little. Let's see. It's always the first few blades or core preparation flakes that are usually a little awkward. So I'll put it in a brace position ready to actually detach some blades. Make sure it's nice and secure. There's a variety of ways that you can actually take the blades off. Some people prefer to strike towards them. I prefer to do it across as I'm used to working normally. You have to be a little bit careful you don't drive the punch into your leg, which is why I try to offset it a little bit and go across with it. So I'll grab my mallet and the best punch for this situation, which I think could be that one. We'll see. Just put the punch in position. In terms of wear on the striking platform, it's about 2 to 3 millimeters into the edge. So it's not right at the edge because remember you've got to undercut material, but it's not too deep because otherwise I'd have to hit it really hard and risk fracturing the end of the punch. Get another little flake driven through there. Punch is still okay. So those two flakes cleaned off the surface nicely, but I've got this issue here. Both hinge and step fractures, and it bulges out horribly. Now there are a couple of ways that you can approach this. You can either hard hammer strike through and just completely undercut it, or you can sometimes approach from the sides. Potentially if I put my punch through here and drive a blade through, I might be able to remove some of this and then get the rest of it off with a follow-up strike. But don't necessarily be tempted just to keep trying to break through it with a punch because it almost certainly won't work. So I'll just abrade it slightly. See if I can undercut this nastiness. There we go. A bit like that. Try and get the next one off. There we go. There's still a little bit more on the side there. Another flaw that's appeared through there. fix it again. There we go. Let's just expose that horrible flaw under there, but at least it's cleaned off the surface. So a convenient way to demonstrate how to get rid of some issues. And if we look back at the platform, we can now see that although I've still got a little bit of area here, I've got this ridge here and a few other little issues, but as I said right at the start, I want them nicely flat and dished. So to get rid of them, I'm going to have to put the platform back on its side and drive a flake across the top just to maintain it really. A bit like that. And there we go. Back to flat and clean. Braid those ridges, because you can actually see if I hold it on the side that there is a bit of a curve here, so there is a concavity here, but if I take off the very end of it, the concavity's gone. So that's exactly what I want to do, is just nip it off really. You're taking off the extreme end of that concavity and it's back to a nice curve. So I'll put it back. Now I can hopefully go for a slightly better blade. There we go. Very gentle tap. Shame it's taken a little flake behind it, but there's the first of hopefully a few blades out of this core. Definitely in the Mesolithic end of the scale, as it's very small and narrow. Pop that out the way. Very light bit of abrasion. Just check that the angle's good. Go for another one, perhaps slightly thicker this time. There we go. Another one through there. Hopefully you'll start to see now that they're starting to go in a straight line. They are following those ridges from the previous removal. And that's where a core changes from just a standard mode 1 style core to more of a prepared core for blade or laminar reduction. So that last flake actually had a dual ridge down it. And this one will probably have a dual ridge down it as well. Although it did snap in half, which they often do. Particularly for the very thin and small blades, they do snap very frequently. It's just trying to find that balance of power to put in enough to actually get the blade to travel through, but not too much that it shatters. And as you're getting used to that particular kind of flint and perhaps changing tools, a couple of breaks is perfectly acceptable. Obviously, I've just done it. And you may well find that certain types of flint or other knappable rock are more susceptible to blade breaks than others. Although glassy stone is really nice for blades, it is quite susceptible to blade breakages as well. And this is a good case study flint to look at because it is really putting up a fight. It certainly had the problems with the flaws at the start, and the blades are snapping. But again, this would have happened in the past. Slightly better bladelet there. They're certainly making the right sound anyway, and they're leaving a nice crisp scar behind, which is exactly what we want. It's just a case of the ridges going in a straight line now, and that will come. It can sometimes take a little bit of work to get them to that point, and once they're there, it's a battle to maintain them. That's slightly better. Now I've got this platform which is dishing quite a lot, so I'm having to hold the punch right on the edge of it, but see it's driven right through. It's taken a bit of material off the side as well, so more like a flake than a blade really. And I think I'm going to drive a platform maintenance flake across the top just to flatten it out again. On some cores you never have to do this, and some you have to do it very frequently. So don't be too disheartened if you're finding that you're having to do this quite a lot, and that's why you wear goggles. So there we go, that's nicely prepared on the top there. Just do a little bit of backwards abrasion, just to take off a couple of little ridges, and I'll put that down there. Let's see if we can get this core to actually behave a little bit. That's a bit more like it. The rest of that floor's just fallen off. And really the blades can only be as long as the flint is, so they're clearly not going to be very long over here because there just isn't the material. See if I can get a few decent blades off this anyway, before I perhaps abandon it. What I'm trying to do is start pushing it back to this slightly thicker area here, so I have got half a chance of getting some decent blades off. It'd be a shame really if all the blades I take off to show you are these teeny blades, although I'm sure the Mesolithic specialists will appreciate it. But everyone likes to see long blades, even the Mesolithic fanciers at heart. So I'm being quite aggressive in taking these blades off. If you notice my leg shaking a little bit, that's just because I'm having to hold this. That's a really awkward angle. But that's a bit cleaner now. So you can see on the flint perhaps, these ridges are starting to follow a straight line, which is more what I want really, but on the top there's some nice points here to go for, although it's not totally concaved here, so I might have to keep an eye on that. But I'll abrade first, because remember I've got these spurs here that I don't want. I'll just take the very end off them. And I'm going to be placing the punch directly above these ridges, because that's where I want the shock to travel. That's a little bit better, it's starting to get into the right realm. Cool, it's putting me to the test this core. It's making me hold it at an awkward angle, full of flaws. So I've got a bit of a convexity there, and I want it to be a concavity, so I'm going to drive a little flake back on myself. And there is that very little flake. That's slightly dished. Good chance for a nice blade through there. Bit like that. It's just taken the end off it. That's fine. If I was trying to make a petit tranché arrowhead, potentially two in there, I'll pop that to the side for now. And where it's taken off, there's a nice set of ridges there and a nice ridge through there. And once you're in that area of getting those ridges and maintaining them, you can start to consistently take blades off with very little maintenance. It is just getting to that point that's the tricky bit sometimes, as you've seen. It's another nice blade through there. So what I've done is I've taken off that flake and the little bladelet that followed it, and that's exposed this ridge. It's made it higher. So the shock that I put in is far more likely to follow that ridge simply because it stands out higher than the flint either side of it. And then have another go. And go for a strike, and there we go. Much nicer. Very nice thin blade. A little bit of edge prep, not much needed. Put it straight back, and go again. Technically a blade, but beginning to look like a flake. Good one for a saw or an end scraper there. Nice ridge here, bit of a concavity here, so I'm just going to put the punch a touch further back just so that concavity isn't so much of an issue. Cool. It's been blooming awkward. Off you come. There you go, good blade. Another one there. Dual ridge, like a miniature gun flint. As you may have already heard me say, an awkward angle to hold it. That's a big flat flake, good leaf arrowhead blank there, just the right thickness. There you go, pretty good. I'll see if I can get anything out of these little blades here. And as I said, I think this one could offer a couple of petit tranché arrowheads. So I'll need a couple of stones for that. One is the anvil, one is the hammer. Make sure it's nicely placed and clamped. What I'm going to do is just knock the ends off like that. That's one side, and this will actually detach the other side very gently. There we go. And that's either a little gun flint or a petit tranché, which I would need to trim a bit more, depending on which end I have as the actual tip of the arrowhead. So I'm using bipolar percussion, that hammer and anvil technique. Just trimming it back. Trying to avoid taking anything off this blade here. There we go, one little petit tranché arrowhead. Potentially another one in here. Slightly wider this time. I'm going to use this as the blade, so I'm going to trim from the sides. I quite like the petit tranchés that have a really flaring blade to them, so that's what I'm going to go for. So there we go, another petit tranché. I mentioned an end scraper before, and this is the one that I think would be good as an end scraper. It has that nice lip that curves up, so all I'm going to do is just chip through here to actually create a mini scraper through here in exactly the same way as I've done with one of the previous videos. Definitely in the realms of the Upper Palaeolithic with an end scraper like this. I still want to make sure these flakes that come off are clean and I'm not just crushing the edge, otherwise it will make a very blunt scraper. And that's why I'm trying to hit it quite decisively rather than just machine gun hitting it. I'm actually looking out for those blades, or flakes rather, that are coming off, and checking each time. There's a couple that have just fractured badly there. As I said, this piece of flint has been blooming awkward. So there we go, that's a pretty decent scraper end on there. Another blade based tool. So I think I've potentially got one more tool here, maybe a little Creswellian point in this. So I have to go back to the bipolar and hammer and anvil. So quite a good angling blade here. And I'm just going to chip 2 angles from this and back it. Perhaps the predecessor to later microliths that are much smaller. There's one side, although there's a real hook over there. I'll just nip the end of that off. It's not quite so extreme. Have that end as the base. And work on the tip. That's very common that bits break off in this method. It's very, very quick and very good for thin flakes, but it can be quite risky. It's very easy for too much to come off. You have to be quite gentle. So it looks like a very, very big trapezoidal microlith at the moment, but I'm just going to trim it down a bit more at the back, so it's not too wide and actually looks a bit more like a Creswellian point. There you go. Pretty decent little Creswellian point. It'd be fixed onto the side of a dart for hunting herd animals. Perhaps a few of these could be fixed both as points and barbs. So pretty easy to make, certainly off nice thin blades. So I'll stick these tools down, and the safety gear, and try and round off a little bit to give you some idea of what should have happened. Now, hopefully you'll appreciate that this is quite a modest view, an honest one into the difficulties of actually trying to take off blades. As you can see, I've had some difficulty both with flaws through the flint that's misbehaved. Not a particularly conveniently shaped piece of flint, but again, these are the issues that people would have had in the past, and they would have had to have worked with it. Punches that decided to chunk and flake and generally misbehave themselves, well, again, aren't particularly ideal, but again, these are perhaps issues that you might have to face as well. And if I gave you a view of the most perfect blade core that really behaved and super long blades, that can be quite disheartening. So hopefully this is a bit more realistic, I suppose. But I'll show you on the whiteboard, hopefully, what it should look like. Now, I've pre-drawn this one just to save a bit of time, really, and because drawing a blade core when you're behind the whiteboard can be a bit tricky as well. But you can see that I've got my nice platform at the top here with my blades that should, in theory, go off. Now, this might seem a much larger view, and this can be larger in theory if you hit the right point, or it can be much, much smaller. As long as it follows this principle, it should work. Now, I haven't touched this side of the blade core because it doesn't curve round nicely like this side does. But you can see, hopefully, that these fracture lines actually follow in a straight line, and you have these ridges that go right through, and particularly for this one here with the dual ridge down the middle, and the blade core that fractures up here and follows right through. That's exactly how it should work. And once these have come off, I'll have this gap here with a ridge either side that I could take another blade off. But essentially, I can take more off. Oof, I get my pen. Once I've ground off these tips here, which I've talked about, so that it comes back to here. So if this is your remaining edge back here after you've taken some blades. You can then take off one there, and one there, and one there, and one there, and one there, because these will be using these ridges. So there's that ridge there, connects up, that ridge there, that ridge there, and that ridge there. And that shock will follow through, and it's that will dictate your flake. And as long as you're keeping your punch tilted, so it's not going straight down, unless you really want the shock to dive through the core, but if you tilt it outwards, it should allow the shock to travel round the outside and actually follow the topography. And this will work whether it be with a hard hammer based removal, though the blades will be slightly thicker, or with direct percussion with a soft hammer, like just a piece of antler, or with indirect as I did there. The principle is pretty much the same. This is exactly what people were doing in both the Upper Palaeolithic and much later in the modern era for gun flints, and whether it be a petit tranché, would come out there. You can have another one there, and then another one there, and it goes on really. So certainly for one of those singular blades there, you can potentially get a few gun flints or petit tranchés out of them, depending on which side of prehistory you're on. And the beauty about blades and blade cores is that once you've got the blades, you have a variety of tools that you can make, whether it again be things like Creswellian points or end scrapers. There's a lot there. Blade cores and blade core based economies are not great for heavy tools, so if you needed to cut down a tree or do some heavy scraping, they're not great for that, and this is perhaps where there were some issues, or people relied on things like antler axes, or they didn't need to do a lot of woodworking or tree felling at all, and perhaps that gives us some idea of how people were living. If they were only producing blades and light tools, then they weren't doing a lot of tree felling that we see much later in the Neolithic, where people are cutting down a lot of trees with axes. You can tell I'm getting towards the end of the video. Lots of this and very little of this. So hopefully that summarises the video and giving you again an honest view of the difficulties of blade cores and how things can be affected very heavily by difficulties in flint that can just present themselves at any time. As I said at the start, on the outside it looked like a really lovely dark piece of flint, full of flaws, and gave me very little to work with. But if you persist, you can still get some decent blades that you can do an awful lot with, and again we see it in archaeology. So that rounds things off for this season of Knap Time. It'll be a sad goodbye to this season, but we're going to take a break and we're going to be looking at ways that we can both improve the videos and bring you some new content. But before I say goodbye for this season, I'd like to point out that we will be adding some other videos that are not part of the Knap Time season. They'll be looking at other things within the ancient craft area. And finally, a big thank you to my team who have actually helped me put together these videos. They'd be rubbish if I was here doing them myself. You'd have me saying, oh, I'm not sure if you can see this. It'd be a nightmare. So a big thank you to Emma Jones and Matt Downs, friends from school who are very, very talented in their own department, certainly an area that I know nothing about. They have actually made these videos a success and made them a lot clearer and better for you guys. And thank you for watching, and I hope you subscribe, and I look forward to making some more of these and putting them out for you guys to enjoy. But until then, I'm going to round off season 1 of Knap Time and say bye for now.